The neutral spire of convoluted agreements was, by any reasonable architectural standard, an abomination. Its twisting corridors led nowhere. Its meeting chambers were either too large or impossibly small, and its air recycling system had the peculiar habit of occasionally emitting scents reminiscent of what most species would consider grandmother's perfume. But such was the price of interstellar diplomacy. Nothing worth achieving could ever be straightforward or pleasant. Ambassador Cthar of the Molluscoid Alliance stood in Reception Hall 7 Delta, 4 of his eye stalks drooping with fatigue, while the remaining 3 maintained the bare minimum of diplomatic alertness. His aide, Zorp, hovered nearby, all eye stalks perky and attentive, a trait Cthar found both admirable and deeply irritating. "Sir," Zorp whispered, his voice bubbling slightly as was common among younger molluscoids, "the Glyptodontian delegation is arriving." Cthar's eye stalks stiffened momentarily. Already? They're usually 4 hours late, minimum. Perhaps they sensed the gravity of this particular session. Zorp suggested hopefully. After 7 centuries of failed negotiations? Doubtful, Cthar muttered, but straightened his posture nonetheless. The massive doors to the reception hall began to part with an agonizingly slow hydraulic whine. The Glyptodontians had insisted on physically opening doors rather than using teleportation pads or dimensional gateways, like most civilized species. Respect for the passage of matter through space-time, they called it. Cthar called a waste of perfectly good minutes he could be spending in his relaxation pod. As the doors completed their glacial parting, the Glyptodontian delegation entered. They were, in essence, giant armored reptilians, each one the size of a small transport vehicle. Their thick, dome-shaped shells were engraved with intricate patterns that shifted subtly as they moved, a form of secondary communication among their kind. They proceeded at what could only be described as a geological pace, their 6 stumpy legs carrying them forward with the urgency of continental drift. The lead delegate, Grand Geologic Elder Kruumtal, emitted a low-frequency hum that made the glassware on nearby refreshment tables vibrate dangerously. Cthar recognized this as the traditional Glyptodontian greeting and responded with a polite bow, his eye stalks executing the proper 7-point weave pattern required by protocol. "Most honored representatives of the Galactic Concordance," boomed Kruumtal at a volume entirely unnecessary for the room size. "We bring the wisdom of stone and the patience of epics." Cthar winced internally, but maintained his diplomatic composure. "Elder Kruumtal, the Concordance welcomes your delegation with." A sudden shift in air currents interrupted him as the ceiling vents opened wide, releasing a shower of iridescent pollen that drifted elegantly to the floor. The HFY delegation had arrived, right on schedule and with their typical flair for dramatic entrances. Unlike the Glyptodontians, the aerophytes were essentially sentient plant-like organisms that floated on self-generated gas cushions. Their translucent bodies pulsed with bioluminescent colors, and tendrils of various lengths hung beneath them, occasionally brushing the floor when they wished to express formality or respect. "Light and buoyancy to all gathered," sang the lead aerophyte. High Drift Coordinator Floxlumina, her body shifting from a diplomatic blue to a slightly more assertive purple. "We hope our pollen does not discomfort the stonebound." This last comment was delivered with a subtle frequency shift that Cthar recognized as barely disguised contempt. Kruumtal's shell patterns darkened momentarily. "Perhaps if your kind could refrain from dispersing your reproductive materials at every gathering, there would be less discomfort. Perhaps if your kind moved faster than sedimentary formation, these talks would have concluded 5 centuries ago." Floxlumina's tendrils stiffened ever so slightly. And there it was, not 3 minutes into the reception, and they were already at each other's throats, or whatever anatomical equivalent applied. Cthar sighed, a small bubble escaping from his respiratory pore. "Distinguished delegates," he interjected smoothly, "the refreshments have been tailored to both lithospheric and atmospheric preferences. Perhaps we might partake before the formal session begins." Both delegations made sounds of grudging agreement and moved, at vastly different speeds, toward opposite sides of the refreshment area. Thar used the momentary respite to whisper to Zorp. 700 years, Zorp. 700 years of the same arguments about the same asteroid belt. Do you know how many reports I've filed? How many balanced analyses of ongoing negotiations I've written? 1,412, sir, Zorp replied. Promptly, not including monthly updates and quarterly projections. Thar's eye stalks drooped further. And what do we have to show for it? A collection of minor skirmishes, ineffective economic sanctions, and enough paperwork to girdle a small moon. But, sir, the Whispering Shoals are of critical importance to both species. The Glyptodontians claim ancestral rights based on deep geological memory, while the Aerophytes need the belt for their atmospheric spore migration routes. Yes, I know the official positions. Thar waved a tentacle dismissively. What I don't know is why the Galactic Concordance Facilitation Bureau keeps assigning us to this particular diplomatic quagmire when it's crystal clear that neither side will ever. Thar was interrupted by a nervous-looking GCFB official, a tall, pencil-thin being with far too many arms, each clutching different data pads. The Supreme Facilitator himself, Liaison Officer Kix Multiform. Ambassador Thar, Kix Multiform whispered urgently, using 3 of his arms to guide Thar and Zorp toward a quiet corner. We need to speak privately. There's been a development. Thar noticed that the Supreme Facilitator was sweating from glands Thar didn't even know his species possessed. What kind of development could possibly occur in a 7-century-old dispute? Kix Multiform glanced nervously around the room, all 17 of his eyes blinking asynchronously, a sure sign of extreme distress among his kind. The Bureau has decided to employ an unconventional approach, he said, his voice dropping so low that Thar had to extend an auditory receptor. We've hired a specialist, a professional problem solver with a record of breaking seemingly unbreakable diplomatic impasses. That sounds promising, Zorp commented brightly. A consultant from... Thar prompted. Kix Multiform's entire body seemed to shrink as he forced out the next words. Earth. Thar nearly dropped his nutritional fluid. His eye stalks twisted into a knot of horror. A human? You brought a human to the peace talks. Please keep your voice down, Kix Multiform pleaded, several of his arms making frantic, shushing motions. Have you lost your mind? Thar hissed. Have you forgotten the sentient cheese incident? Or the paper-eating nanite disaster? Or what about the diplomatic ball of 47, when a human dance move caused the crystalline hegemony's ambassador to shatter into 17 pieces? The Bureau is aware of humanity's unconventional approaches, Kix Multiform admitted. But we've reached a point of desperation. 7 centuries, Ambassador Thar. Resources are being wasted. Political capital is being squandered. The Concordance's credibility is at stake. So your solution is to introduce chaos incarnate into the most delicate, long-running negotiation in the quadrant. Thar's skin was beginning to take on the mottled green pattern that indicated extreme distress among molluscoids. The human consultant comes highly recommended. Agent Kai Sharma has successfully mediated 3 previously intractable conflicts. And how many new conflicts did this Sharma create in the process? Thar demanded. Before Kix Multiform could answer, a commotion erupted near the main doors. Security officials were gesturing frantically, communication devices were beeping, and a general wave of confusion seemed to ripple through the gathering. What now? Thar groaned. That's odd. Kix Multiform frowned, checking one of his many data pads. The human isn't scheduled to arrive until tomorrow's formal session. A loud metallic clang from above drew everyone's attention to the ceiling, where a maintenance hatch was now swinging open. Before anyone could react, a figure dropped gracefully from the opening, landing in a crouch directly between the Glyptodontian and Aerophyte delegations. The figure straightened, revealing a human of average height with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. They wore what appeared to be a simple black jumpsuit with multiple pockets, and in one hand, they clutched a steaming container of dark liquid. Sorry about the entrance, the human announced cheerfully, taking a sip from the container. Your security protocols are impressively thorough but embarrassingly outdated. I'd suggest quantum locking your maintenance tunnels, for starters. The room had fallen into stunned silence. Even the glyptodontians, who typically took several minutes to register surprise, had immediately halted all movement, their shell patterns frozen in expressions of shock. "You must be the Rock Squad," the human said, gesturing toward the glyptodontians with the steaming cup. "And you're the Pollen Patrol," nodding at the aerophytes. "I'm Kai Sharma. I've been hired to sort out your little asteroid belt situation." Kthar watched in horrified fascination as the human strolled casually toward the refreshment table, ignoring the sputtering Kix multiform, who was trying desperately to initiate the proper introduction protocols. But the formal credentials exchange, the ritual of mutual acknowledgement. Kix multiform stammered. "Yeah, I looked at your standard procedures," Sharma said, examining the refreshments and wrinkling their nose slightly. 7 hours of introductions, 12 hours of preliminary position statements, followed by 3 days of contextual history recitation. "No thanks. We're going to speed things up a bit." The human turned to face the two delegations directly, crossing their arms. "So, rocks versus spores, huh? Fighting over the Whispering Shoals for 700 years? That's a pretty long time to get nowhere. How dare you trivialize our sacred claim?" Kruum Tal's voice made the floor vibrate. "The memory of stone predates your species' discovery of fire, and our atmospheric migratory patterns have been established for millennia before this. Lumbering fossils' ancestors crawled from the primordial ooze." Flox Lumina pulsed an angry red. "Uh-huh," Sharma nodded, seemingly unimpressed. "Here's what we're going to do. I need all data on the Whispering Shoals. Not just your religious texts or migration maps. I want geological surveys, economic reports, shipping manifests, satellite scans, the works. Such information is voluminous and much is classified," began Kix Multiform. "Great, let's get started," Sharma interrupted, pulling out a small handheld device. "I've just bypassed your central archive security. Don't worry, I didn't break anything important. Just made myself a temporary admin user." Kthar's eye stalks twisted in disbelief as he watched the human casually scroll through what appeared to be highly restricted GCFB files on their device. Beside him, Zorp was taking notes at a frantic pace. "Sir," Zorp whispered, "is this legal?" "With humans, Zorp, the question isn't whether it's legal," Kthar responded grimly. "The question is whether we'll survive it." After several minutes of rapid data scanning, Sharma looked up with a raised eyebrow. "Interesting. Very interesting. You know what? I gotta say these ancestral claims and spore migration routes both sound pretty fabricated." The room erupted in outraged sounds from both delegations. "Yeah, I'm going to need better evidence," Sharma continued, unfazed by the uproar. "Real evidence. Data I can actually verify. Both delegations will present their cases to me tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Galactic Standard. Bring facts, not mythology, and be prepared to answer some uncomfortable questions." With that, the human took another sip from their container, nodded to the room at large, and strolled out through the main doors, which Kthar noted with dismay had been properly unlocked and opened without anyone noticing. As pandemonium broke out around them, Kthar turned to Zorp with all eye stalks extended in alarm. "Bringing a human to the peace talks," he said quietly. "That's not peace, Zorp. That's like throwing a grenade into the archives." He shuddered, his skin rippling with concern. "Or more precisely, that's not peace, that's a threat." The frantic activity within the Glyptodontian diplomatic quarters could best be described as tectonic panic. Their typical glacial pace had accelerated to something approaching the speed of slowly flowing lava, practically light speed by their standards. "The human cannot be serious," rumbled Subalder Grok Stoneheart as he shuffled through ancient stone tablets. "Our claim to the Whispering Shoals is embedded in the very strata of our historical record." "Yes, but the human seems unimpressed by historical records that cannot be independently verified," pointed out Junior Geological Attaché Pebble Sift, the youngest and therefore most adaptable member of their delegation. "They want empirical evidence." Meanwhile, in the airy chambers assigned to the Aerophyte delegation, A similar crisis was unfolding, albeit at a much faster pace. Tendrils whipped about in agitation, colors shifted rapidly across the spectrum, and pollen discharged in erratic bursts. The aerophyte equivalent of a collective nervous breakdown. Ridiculous! Phlox pulsated in outrage. How can we produce empirical evidence of migratory patterns that exist primarily in the collective botanical memory of our species? Perhaps, suggested Drift, Navigator, Spore Whisper cautiously, we could focus on the current importance of the belt to our reproduction cycles rather than historical precedent. Both delegations, though they would never admit it, were facing the same uncomfortable realization. Their traditional arguments, steeped in belief and legend rather than fact, would not work on this human. More concerning still was what actual evidence might reveal if examined too closely. The next morning, precisely at 9 a.m. Galactic Standard, Sharma had commandeered a small conference room. Gone were the ceremonial tables and ancient seating arrangements that usually characterized GCFB negotiations. Instead, the human had installed whiteboards, marker pens, and an even larger personal beverage machine than before. The delegations were instructed to sit uncomfortably close to each other, with only a narrow table separating ancient enemies. "Good morning," Sharma announced briskly, a fresh cup of the dark liquid in hand. "I spent the night analyzing the data. Let's cut to the chase." The human tapped their device, and a holographic display appeared above the table, showing spectral analyses and archaeological scans of the Whispering Shoals. "These readings are interesting," Sharma said, highlighting several anomalies in the data. The mineral composition of several asteroids in the belt doesn't match either Glyptodontian geological formations or aerophyte spore substrates. Both delegations shifted uncomfortably. In fact, Sharma continued, zooming in on one particular section, there are traces of technology far more ancient than either of your species' spacefaring eras, along with some very unusual mineral deposits that don't seem related to either rocks or spores. Thar, observing from the small observer's area with Zorp, noticed how both delegation leaders seemed to avoid looking at the highlighted sections. "But here's what's even more interesting," Sharma said, switching the display to show shipping routes and waste management reports. "There's been a lot of activity in and around the shoals that doesn't appear in official reports. Unmarked transport vessels, unexplained radiation signatures, chemical traces that don't belong in a natural asteroid formation." The human turned to face the delegations directly. "So let's stop talking about ancestral claims and spore migrations for a minute. Let's talk about industrial waste disposal and unregulated harvesting operations instead." A heavy silence fell over the room. Thar's eye stalks extended in surprise as he watched both delegation leaders' body language change from indignation to something approaching. "Guilt? I don't understand," Zorp whispered. "What is the human implying?" "I believe," Thar replied slowly, "that our persistent problem solver has uncovered the real reason this conflict has remained unresolved for 7 centuries. Sharma pressed on, displaying an analysis of a dark, viscous substance. "This is industrial sludge from manufacturing plants on the Glyptodontian homeworld. Highly toxic, extremely expensive to dispose of properly. And yet, the human swiped to a new image showing dark stains on several asteroids. It seems to be turning up inside certain hollowed-out asteroids in the Whispering Shoals. Cruum-Tal shell patterns had gone almost completely dark, the Glyptodontian equivalent of a mortified blush. And this," Sharma continued, displaying a glowing fungal growth, "is luminous driftcap, a rare fungus that only grows on certain types of asteroid dust. It happens to be the primary ingredient in a rather expensive recreational substance that's technically illegal in 17 star systems." Phlox color had shifted to a deep, embarrassed purple, her tendrils drawn in tight against her body. "You see what's happening here?" Sharma looked between the two delegations. "The Glyptodontians need the shoals because they've been secretly using it as a toxic waste dump for centuries, much cheaper than proper disposal. And the aerophytes need it because they've been harvesting these fungi to produce designer drugs. Kthar watched as the facade of diplomatic dignity crumbled away from both delegations. 7 centuries of posturing dissolved in minutes under the humans' relentless exposure of truth. "You see, Zorp," Kthar whispered, "humans don't solve problems. They find the real weakness, the thing everyone is trying to hide, and they press on it. They don't break the stalemate. They destroy the entire game board." Over the next several hours, the workshop devolved into a tense interrogation. Sharma displayed irrefutable evidence. Satellite images of Glyptodontian waste disposal ships, chemical analyses linking asteroid dust to industrial waste, financial records connecting aerophyte corporations to black market fungal sales. "Your waste disposal has contaminated our fungal harvests." Phlox Slumina finally burst out, abandoning all pretense of dignity. Her color had shifted to an angry red so intense it was nearly blinding. "Your illegal harvesting disturbed our carefully planned waste containment systems." Kruumtal thundered back, shell patterns flashing in rage. "Ah, so you both admit to your activities," Sharma said calmly, making notes on their device. "That's progress." The delegations fell into chaotic accusations and counter-accusations, centuries of carefully constructed diplomatic language abandoned in favor of raw, unfiltered blame. Sharma let them continue for several minutes before, deliberately knocking over their beverage container. The dark liquid spreading across the table instantly silenced the room. "Enough," the humans said quietly, but with an authority that even the eldest Glyptodontian could not ignore. "Let me be clear about where we stand. This isn't about ancient rocks or sacred spores. This is about you both facing massive fines from the Galactic Environmental Protection Agency and prison time from the Interspecies Commerce Bureau." Sharma held up their device. "I've drafted 2 extremely detailed reports, complete with all the evidence I've gathered. All I need to do is hit send." The human looked directly into the eyes, or equivalent sensory organs, of each delegation leader, and Kthar felt a chill run down his mantle as he recognized the expression. It was the same look a predator gives its prey just before pouncing. "Or," Sharma continued, voice frighteningly calm, "you both can stop this charade right now. Sit down, and within the next 24 hours, come up with a joint plan to clean up this mess and manage the shoals legally and transparently. If that plan is good enough, perhaps these reports might accidentally get deleted due to a system error." The human smiled slightly, a smile that made Kthar shudder. After a tense silence that seemed to stretch into infinity, the Glyptodontian and aerophyte delegations began urgent, desperate discussions right where they sat. The traditional separation of species, the careful protocols of interaction, all abandoned in the face of this new, common enemy, exposure and legal consequences. Sharma stood with arms crossed, watching, occasionally throwing out a pragmatic suggestion or a subtle reminder of the send button. Kthar was fascinated by the transformation. Ancient enemies were now collaborating with a desperation he had never witnessed in 7 centuries of observations. "This is unprecedented," Zorp whispered, taking notes at a frantic pace. "They're actually negotiating, really negotiating." "Yes," Kthar replied. "Fear is quite the motivator." Under Sharma's watchful eye, the delegations quickly drafted the Joint Treaty on Environmental Restoration and Resource Management of the Whispering Shoals. The terms focused on sharing cleanup costs, establishing strictly regulated fungal harvesting zones, and joint monitoring measures. The signing ceremony took place with none of the pomp and circumstance that typically characterize GCFB affairs. It was almost secretive, with a pale but relieved Supreme Facilitator witnessing the proceedings. Sharma merely nodded in satisfaction, finishing a final cup of their dark beverage. Afterward, as the delegations departed to begin implementing their emergency agreement, Kthar approached the human. "I must admit, Agent Sharma, your methods are unorthodox." Sharma shrugged. "Sometimes the best way to get people to cooperate is to show them a much worse alternative if they don't. Call it negative motivation. Is that the human approach to peace? Threats and exposure. It's the human approach to results," Sharma replied. 7 centuries, Ambassador. 7 centuries of resources wasted on a conflict that was never about what anyone claimed it was about. Would you rather have 7 more centuries of the same, or a solution now? Kthar's eye stalks wavered thoughtfully. When you put it that way. Besides, Sharma added with a small smile, both sides got what they really needed, continued access to the shoals, just with proper oversight now. Sometimes peace doesn't look like what we expect it to. As they spoke, Kthar noticed ambassadors from other ongoing conflicts cautiously approaching Sharma, discreetly offering data devices. Word of the human problem solver was spreading throughout the spire. It seems you've become quite popular, Kthar observed. Efficiency usually is, Sharma replied, checking the time on their device. I should go. I got another seemingly intractable conflict to solve 2 systems over. Something about sentient gas clouds and gravitational rights. Kthar watched as Sharma departed, this time through a loading bay by hopping onto a passing cargo vessel. Zorp joined him, still frantically making notes. Sir, Zorp asked, would you say this is truly peace? Kthar's eye stalks rotated slowly as he watched the ship disappear into the distance. Not peace as we know it, Zorp. This is an outcome. Quick, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. This is peace created from threat. He paused, several of his eye stalks drooping in thought. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I like it, but I cannot deny its efficacy. As they turned to leave, Zorp asked one final question. Do you think the Bureau will employ more humans in the future? Kthar considered this for a moment, his skin shifting to a contemplative blue-gray. I suspect so, Zorp. The universe has no shortage of conflicts, and conventional diplomacy clearly has its limitations. But remember this, when dealing with humans, success often comes with collateral effects. What kind of effects, sir? The kind that reshape the very nature of the game. Kthar replied softly. Humans don't just solve problems, Zorp. They change the rules by which problems are defined. And that, perhaps, is why they're both so useful and so terrifying. As they made their way back through the twisting corridors of a neutral spire of convoluted agreements, Kthar couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt. The usual heavy cloud of stagnant diplomacy had been replaced with something new. A nervous energy, a sense of possibility mingled with apprehension. In 7 centuries of diplomatic service, Kthar had filed 1,412 reports on the Whispering Shoals conflict. Tomorrow, he would file report number 1,413, the final one. It would be brief, efficient, and slightly terrifying, just like humans themselves.